Rex dragged Jake's unconscious body 200 yards through freezing snow, his own legs failing with each step, blood trailing behind him. The German shepherd knew this would be his final rescue mission, but he refused to let his Marine die alone in the wilderness. This is the incredible true story of Jake Morrison, a Marine veteran, and Rex, a military working dog who saved his handler's life not once, not twice, but 3 times. The first 2 saves happened in the heat of battle in Afghanistan, but the 3rd save, years later on American soil, would cost Rex everything and prove that the bond between a soldier and his dog transcends even death itself. Before we begin, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're listening from. Now, let me tell you about the day Jake Morrison first met the dog who would become his guardian angel. 22-year-old Marine Lance Corporal Jake Morrison stepped off the transport plane at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, his boots hitting the dusty tarmac under a blazing sun that felt like it could melt steel. The year was 2009, and Jake had volunteered for his first deployment, driven by a desire to serve his country and make a difference. What he didn't know was that in 3 days he would meet a 4-legged partner who would change his life forever. Jake had grown up on a farm in rural Montana, surrounded by working dogs his entire life. His family raised cattle, and their border collies were essential members of the operation. So when his commanding officer asked if anyone had experience with dogs, Jake's hand shot up without hesitation. He thought he knew what he was getting into. He was wrong. The military working dog compound at Bagram was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. Rows of kennels housed dozens of German shepherds, Belgian Malinois, and Labrador retrievers, each one a highly trained specialist in detection, patrol, or explosive ordnance disposal. The cacophony of barking filled the air as Jake walked through with Sergeant Martinez, the kennel master who would oversee his training. "Morrison, meet Rex," Martinez said, stopping in front of a kennel that housed a massive German shepherd with intelligent brown eyes and a coat that gleamed like polished copper in the afternoon sun. "He's been through 3 handlers already. Smart as hell, but he's picky about who he works with." Rex stood at attention, his ears perked forward, studying Jake with an intensity that was almost human. The dog was imposing, weighing nearly 90 pounds of pure muscle and determination. His previous handlers had described him as stubborn, independent, and sometimes disobedient. What they failed to understand was that Rex wasn't being difficult. He was being selective. Jake approached the kennel slowly, extending his hand palm down for Rex to smell. Most dogs would sniff cautiously, maybe give a tentative lick. Rex did something different. He pressed his nose firmly against Jake's palm and held it there for several seconds, as if he was reading something in Jake's scent, his energy, his very soul. Then, for the first time in months according to Martinez, Rex's tail wagged. The next morning, their formal training began. Jake learned that Rex was a dual-purpose dog, trained in both explosive detection and patrol work. He could find hidden IEDs with his nose and take down an insurgent with his teeth. But what made Rex special wasn't just his training, it was his intuition. Other handlers had tried to dominate him, to break his independent spirit. Jake took a different approach. He listened. During their first week together, Jake noticed things about Rex that others had missed. The dog had quirks that weren't mentioned in his file. He refused to eat from a metal bowl, preferring plastic. He had a favorite tennis ball that he carried everywhere, but never played fetch. Most importantly, Rex had an uncanny ability to sense danger before any equipment could detect it. His body language would change, his ears would twitch in a specific pattern, and his breathing would become shallow and controlled. The breakthrough came during a training exercise in the mountains outside Bagram. They were practicing IED detection in a mock village when Rex suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. According to the training scenario, there should have been no explosives in that particular area. Rex sat down and stared at Jake, then looked pointedly at a pile of rubble 15 feet to their left. The trainers insisted there was nothing there, but Jake had learned to trust his partner. "Check it again," Jake insisted, his hand resting on Rex's head. The dog's muscles were tense, coiled like a spring ready to explode into action if needed. The trainers were annoyed. but they humored the new team. Hidden beneath the rubble, placed there by another training unit for a different exercise, was a live training device that could have seriously injured someone. Rex had detected it, even though it wasn't part of their scenario, even though no human had any reason to suspect it was there. That night, as Jake sat in his bunk writing a letter home, Rex lay at his feet, the first time the dog had relaxed completely since Jake had arrived. Martinez stopped by and saw them together. "I've never seen him do that with anyone else," he said quietly. "I think you two are going to do just fine out there." But neither Martinez nor Jake could have predicted just how fine they would need to be, or how many times Rex would prove that some bonds transcend training, transcend species, and transcend even the boundaries between life and death. 3 months into their deployment, Jake and Rex had become the go-to team for the most dangerous missions in their sector. Their success rate was unprecedented. They had detected 17 improvised explosive devices without a single false positive, and their patrol work had led to the capture of 3 high-value targets. But it was a routine patrol on a scorching Tuesday morning in July that would test their bond in ways neither of them was prepared for. The mission briefing had been standard: Patrol Route Silver, a dusty road that connected 2 small villages in Helmand province. Intelligence reports suggested the area was clear of insurgent activity, making it what the Marines called a milk run, easy duty that would give newer teams experience without significant risk. Jake should have known that in Afghanistan there was no such thing as a routine patrol. Their convoy consisted of 4 vehicles, 2 MRAPs loaded with Marines, a Humvee carrying communications equipment, and Jake's vehicle bringing up the rear. Rex rode beside him, his harness secured, but his head out the window, nose working constantly to analyze the thousands of scents carried on the desert wind. The dog's behavior that morning had been different from the start. He was restless, whining softly every few minutes, something he never did on patrol. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, reaching over to stroke Rex's head. "Just another day at the office." But Rex wouldn't settle. His ears kept swiveling forward and back, and he kept looking at Jake with an expression that seemed almost urgent. Dogs can't talk, but Rex was trying to communicate something important, and Jake was starting to get worried. 2 miles down Route Silver, Rex suddenly erupted into a frenzy of barking unlike anything Jake had ever heard from him. It wasn't his alert bark or his aggressive bark. This was pure panic, desperate and frantic. Rex threw himself against his harness, trying to get to the front of the vehicle, his claws scrambling against the metal floor. "Whoa, Rex, what's wrong?" Jake grabbed his radio. "Command, this is Dog Team 1. My K9 is exhibiting extreme stress behavior. Request permission to halt the convoy and investigate." The response crackled back immediately. "Negative, Dog Team 1. Intelligence shows the route is clear. Continue mission as planned." But Rex was beyond agitated now. The 90-pound German shepherd was throwing his entire body weight against his restraints, his eyes locked on something ahead that Jake couldn't see. Foam flecked the corners of his mouth, and his breathing came in sharp, rapid pants. In all their months together, Jake had never seen Rex lose control like this. Jake made a decision that would save 11 lives. He keyed his radio again, his voice firm despite the doubt creeping into his mind. "Command, I'm calling a halt. My dog is indicating a threat, and I trust his nose more than your intelligence reports." The convoy ground to a stop, Marines grumbling about delays and false alarms. Jake's commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, jogged back to their position, his face flushed with anger and heat. "Morrison, what the hell are you doing? We have a schedule to keep." "Sir, Rex is telling me something's wrong up ahead. He's never acted like this before." Jake was already suiting up in his bomb disposal gear, even though he wasn't technically EOD qualified. Rex had gone completely silent now, sitting at perfect attention but trembling with barely contained energy. Captain Reynolds was about to order them to move out when Rex did something extraordinary. The dog looked directly at the officer, then performed a perfect down command that Jake had never taught him. In military working dog protocol, an unprompted down meant only one thing: explosives detected. "Jesus Christ," Reynolds whispered. "Get EOD up here." Now! The explosive ordnance disposal team took 45 minutes to arrive, 45 minutes during which Rex never moved from his position, never took his eyes off a spot roughly 100 meters ahead where the road curved slightly to the left. When the EOD specialists finally approached with their equipment, what they found made everyone's blood run cold. Buried beneath the road surface was the largest IED any of them had ever encountered. 6 artillery shells wired together with enough explosive force to vaporize every vehicle in the convoy. The trigger mechanism was sophisticated, designed to detonate when the third vehicle in a convoy passed over it, exactly where Jake and Rex would have been. The disposal took 3 more hours. When it was finally over, Captain Reynolds walked back to Jake's position, where Rex was finally relaxing, accepting pets and praise from a handful of Marines who now looked at him with something approaching reverence. "Morrison," Reynolds said quietly. "How did he know?" "Our intel said this route was clean. We swept it yesterday." Jake scratched behind Rex's ears, feeling the warm weight of his partner pressed against his leg. "I don't know, sir. But Rex knew. Somehow, he knew." What Jake didn't say, what he was just beginning to understand, was that Rex hadn't just detected explosives that day. He had detected death itself, sensed it waiting patiently beneath the road, and refused to let his Marine walk into its embrace. After the IED incident on Route Silver, word about Jake and Rex spread through the base like wildfire. They weren't just another dog team anymore. They were the duo that had saved an entire convoy from certain death. But with recognition came responsibility, and their missions became increasingly dangerous as commanders began relying on Rex's almost supernatural ability to detect threats that equipment and intelligence missed. Their daily routine started before dawn in the crushing heat of the Afghan summer. While other Marines were grabbing chow and checking their gear, Jake would spend an hour with Rex in what had become their ritual. They would run the perimeter of the base together, not for exercise but for connection. Rex would investigate every scent, every change from the day before, building a mental map of their world that Jake was only beginning to understand. Rex had quirks that made him different from every other military working dog on the base. He refused to sleep in his kennel, instead choosing to curl up on the floor beside Jake's cot, always positioning himself between Jake and the door. He had an obsession with Jake's boots, spending several minutes each morning sniffing them thoroughly as if reading a newspaper written in scent. Most remarkably, he seemed to understand English far beyond his training commands. "We're going out today, boy," Jake would say during their morning routine, and Rex would immediately trot to where his tactical harness hung on the wall. Say, "chow time," and Rex would head toward the mess tent. Mention another handler's name, and Rex would look in that person's direction. It was as if he had learned the language through pure desire to understand his human partner better. Other Marines began seeking them out for the most critical missions. Staff Sergeant Williams, a tough-as-nails infantry leader with 3 deployments under his belt, specifically requested Jake and Rex for a raid on a suspected weapons cache. "I've got kids going home to their families because of that dog," he told Jake one evening as they sat cleaning weapons. "Rex saved my nephew's life on that convoy. I trust him more than I trust satellite imagery. But it wasn't just Rex's detection abilities that made him special. It was his fierce loyalty to every member of their unit." During a patrol in late August, Private Martinez, a 19-year-old from Texas, stepped on a pressure plate IED that failed to detonate. He froze in terror, afraid that lifting his foot would trigger the explosion that would kill him. While the EOD team worked to disarm the device, Rex lay down next to Martinez and rested his head on the young Marine's leg, staying there for 2 hours until it was safe to move. Rex had a memory that seemed almost human in its complexity. He recognized the sound of specific helicopters and would alert differently for medical evacuations versus supply drops. He knew which Marines were going home soon and would spend extra time with them, as if sensing their mixture of excitement and guilt at leaving their brothers behind. When Corporal Johnson was killed by a sniper, Rex spent 3 days searching for him, refusing food until Jake finally sat down and explained, in words he hoped the dog would understand, that Johnson wasn't coming back. The dog's intelligence extended to problem-solving in ways that amazed everyone who witnessed it. During a night patrol in September, their route was blocked by a suspicious pile of debris that could have hidden explosives. While Jake was calling for backup, Rex disappeared into the darkness. 20 minutes later, he returned leading a local boy, maybe 10 years old, who had been hiding nearby. Through an interpreter, they learned that Taliban fighters had forced the child to place the debris there, but that there were no explosives. It was just a distraction to slow down American patrols while insurgents moved weapons through another area. As the months passed, Jake began to realize that Rex wasn't just detecting physical threats. The dog seemed to sense emotional danger too, staying especially close to Marines who were struggling with the psychological toll of combat. He would seek out soldiers who were withdrawing from their units, offering silent companionship to men who were fighting battles inside their own minds. But even as their reputation grew and their success rate remained perfect, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Rex was holding something back, that the dog's abilities went even deeper than anyone suspected. Late at night, when the base was quiet except for the distant sound of generators and the occasional crack of sniper fire, Jake would catch Rex staring into the darkness with an intensity that made his skin crawl. It was as if the dog could see something out there that no human could perceive, something that was patiently waiting for its moment to strike. October brought cooler nights to Afghanistan, but increased Taliban activity as insurgents tried to make their final push before winter forced them into hiding. Intelligence reports indicated a high-value target was moving through their sector, a bomb maker responsible for at least 40 coalition casualties. Jake and Rex were assigned to a night patrol with specific orders to interdict any suspicious movement along a network of mountain trails that provided cover for insurgent activities. The patrol began at 0200 hours under a moonless sky that turned the landscape into a maze of shadows and uncertain shapes. Jake's night vision goggles gave him a green-tinted view of the world, but he had learned to rely more on Rex's natural senses than any technological advantage. The dog moved like a ghost beside him, his black harness making him nearly invisible against the rocky terrain. Their unit consisted of 12 Marines moving in a tactical column through terrain that favored the enemy. Canyon walls rose on both sides, creating natural choke points where a well-positioned sniper could pin down an entire squad. Jake's position was in the middle of the formation, where Rex could provide early warning for threats from any direction. But tonight, the dog's behavior was different in a way that made Jake's combat instincts scream warnings. Rex kept stopping every few meters, his head tilted at an angle that Jake had never seen before. The dog wasn't alerting to explosives or indicating a threat. He was listening to something that apparently only he could hear. His ears would swivel independently, tracking sounds that were beyond human perception, and his breathing had become shallow and controlled, the way it got when he was processing complex information. "Command, this is Dog Team 1, Jake whispered into his radio. "My K9 is exhibiting unusual behavior. Recommend we modify our route." Lieutenant Palmer's voice crackled back through the earpiece. "Negative, Dog Team 1. We're on a timeline here. Continue mission as planned." But Rex had gone completely still, his body lowered to the ground in a crouch that Jake had never seen him use before. The dog's eyes were locked on the canyon walls above them, and every muscle in his body was coiled like a spring under extreme tension. Jake had learned to read Rex's body language like a second language, and what he was seeing now terrified him. Rex turned his head slowly until he was looking directly at Jake, and in the dog's eyes was an expression of pure urgency. Then, without any command or provocation, Rex launched himself at Jake with enough force to knock the Marine completely off his feet. Jake hit the rocky ground hard, his rifle clattering away as Rex's weight drove the air from his lungs. The first burst of automatic gunfire erupted exactly where Jake had been standing 3 seconds earlier. Taliban fighters positioned in the canyon walls opened up with coordinated fire from at least 6 different positions. Tracer rounds lit up the night like deadly fireworks, ricocheting off rocks and filling the air with the whine of bullets and the sharp crack of rifles. Jake's squad dove for cover behind whatever protection they could find as the kill zone erupted into chaos. "Ambush! Ambush! Take cover!" Lieutenant Palmer's voice was nearly lost in the cacophony of gunfire, But his Marines were already moving, their training taking over as they sought firing positions and began returning fire toward the muzzle flashes above them. Rex had saved Jake's life by knocking him down, but the dog wasn't finished. As Jake fumbled for his weapon, Rex was already moving, using the terrain with an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural. The dog bounded from rock to rock, staying low but moving with purpose toward a position where Jake could see muzzle flashes from at least 2 enemy fighters. "Rex, no! Get back here!" Jake shouted, but his voice was lost in the firefight. He watched in horror as his partner disappeared into the darkness, moving toward what appeared to be certain death. What happened next would be talked about in Marine Corps circles for years to come. Rex appeared behind the Taliban position like a phantom, his attack silent and devastating. The first fighter never knew what hit him. The second had time to scream before Rex's training took over. But the dog didn't stop there. He systematically worked his way along the canyon wall, using his speed and the element of surprise to neutralize threat after threat. The ambush that should have lasted hours was over in 12 minutes. When the shooting stopped and the Marines began counting their casualties, they found something that defied explanation. Rex had single-handedly neutralized 4 enemy fighters, disrupted 3 more positions, and created enough chaos in the Taliban ranks to allow the Marines to gain fire superiority and break the ambush. Jake found Rex sitting calmly beside the body of the high-value target they had been hunting, the bomb maker who would never again plant devices designed to kill American soldiers. The dog's fur was matted with blood, but he showed no signs of injury. He had somehow navigated a kill zone in complete darkness, eliminated multiple threats, and completed their mission objectives without losing a single Marine. As the unit prepared to exfiltrate, Jake knelt beside his partner and wrapped his arms around the dog's neck. "How did you know?" he whispered. Rex just pressed his head against Jake's chest, his tail wagging slowly, as if what he had just accomplished was simply part of his job description. November in Afghanistan brought bitter cold that cut through even the best military gear, but Jake and Rex had adapted to their environment like a perfectly synchronized machine. Their reputation had grown beyond their unit, beyond their base, beyond their province. They were the team that had never lost a Marine, the duo that could sense danger before it materialized. But war has a way of humbling even the most successful soldiers, and their luck was about to be tested in ways neither of them was prepared for. The mission briefing on November 15th seemed routine: provide security for an engineering unit that was repairing a bridge crucial for supply convoys. The area had been quiet for weeks, and intelligence reports showed no insurgent activity within a 10-kilometer radius. Jake should have been suspicious of any mission described as routine, but after 8 months of deployment, even he was starting to believe they were untouchable. Rex's behavior that morning had been normal, which was the first warning sign Jake missed. Throughout their deployment, the dog had been most agitated before their most dangerous missions, as if he could sense threats that were still hours away. But that morning, Rex was relaxed, playful even, chasing a tennis ball around their staging area while Jake checked his equipment for the 10th time. The engineering site was located in a valley surrounded by hills that provided excellent overwatch positions for snipers, but the area had been cleared by other units the day before. Jake and Rex positioned themselves on a small rise overlooking the bridge, where they could observe the approaches and provide early warning for any threats. It was a perfect position with clear fields of fire in all directions, which also made it a perfect target. The sniper was positioned nearly 800 meters away, well beyond the range where Rex could detect human scent or hear movement. The shot came without warning, a single crack that echoed off the valley walls as Jake spun and fell, the bullet tearing through his left shoulder and exiting just below his collarbone. The impact threw him backward, his rifle flying from his hands as blood began soaking through his body armor. Rex's reaction was instantaneous and devastating in its intensity. The dog launched himself in the direction of the gunshot, his protective instincts overriding 8 months of careful training. Jake, fighting to stay conscious as shock began setting in, could only watch helplessly as his partner charged directly toward a concealed enemy position. "Rex, no! Come back!" Jake's voice was weakened by pain and blood loss, But Rex either didn't hear him or chose to ignore the command. The dog disappeared over a ridge, leaving Jake alone and vulnerable while Taliban fighters began moving toward his position. What followed was a nightmare that Jake would relive in his dreams for years to come. Unable to use his radio because of his injuries, unable to defend himself with his rifle, Jake could only listen to the sounds of gunfire and Rex's fierce barking as his partner engaged multiple enemies somewhere beyond his line of sight. The sounds of combat grew closer, then farther away, then closer again, as if Rex was drawing the fighters away from Jake's position. The medevac helicopter arrived 23 minutes later, guided to Jake's location by the GPS beacon in his radio that had activated automatically when he was hit. As the corpsman loaded him onto a stretcher, Jake kept asking about Rex, but no one had seen the dog since he had disappeared in pursuit of the sniper. "We'll find him," the helicopter crew chief shouted over the rotor noise. "Dogs are tough. He'll be fine." But Jake could see the doubt in the man's eyes, could hear the uncertainty behind his reassuring words. During the flight to the field hospital, Jake faded in and out of consciousness, but every time he was aware, his first thought was of Rex. Where was he? Was he injured? Was he even alive? The medical staff kept telling him to focus on his own recovery, but Jake couldn't let go of the image of his partner charging toward danger to protect him. The surgery took 4 hours, removing bone fragments and repairing torn blood vessels where the sniper's bullet had done its damage. When Jake woke up in the recovery ward, his first word was Rex. A chaplain was sitting beside his bed, and the expression on the man's face told Jake everything he needed to know before a single word was spoken. Rex had been found 12 hours after the attack, lying in a defensive position over the body of the sniper who had shot Jake. The dog had taken 3 bullets, but had refused to abandon his post until other Marines arrived. He was alive, barely, and was being treated at the base veterinary facility. But his injuries were severe, and his chances of survival were uncertain. Jake's medical evacuation to Germany, then to Walter Reed Medical Center, then finally home to Montana, felt like traveling through a series of increasingly surreal dreams. The physical healing was straightforward. Torn muscles and damaged bone would mend with time and physical therapy. But the psychological wounds ran deeper than any surgeon's knife could reach, and Jake found himself obsessed with questions that had no easy answers. Where was Rex? How badly was he hurt? Would Jake ever see his partner again? The military bureaucracy moved with frustrating slowness when it came to wounded animals. Rex had survived his injuries, but required multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation at a specialized facility in Germany. The Army's initial plan was to retire Rex from service and place him with a new family, but Jake fought that decision with every resource he could muster. He called his congressman, his senator, and anyone else who would listen. Rex wasn't just a military asset. He was Jake's partner, his brother, his lifeline to sanity. The adoption process took 8 months. 8 months during which Jake struggled to find his place in a civilian world that seemed simultaneously too fast and too slow, too loud and too quiet, too safe and too dangerous. His parents' ranch in Montana felt like a foreign country after his deployment. The wide open spaces that had once meant freedom now felt exposed and vulnerable. The silence at night, which should have been peaceful, was filled with phantom sounds of gunfire and helicopter rotors. Jake's homecoming had been everything his family had hoped for: yellow ribbons, welcome home signs, a barbecue with neighbors and friends who wanted to hear war stories. But Jake found himself unable to connect with people who had never experienced combat, never felt the weight of life and death decisions, never understood what it meant to depend completely on another living being for survival. He answered their questions politely, but felt like he was describing someone else's life. The nightmares started during his second week home. Jake would wake up screaming Rex's name, his body soaked in sweat, his heart racing as if he were still under fire. In his dreams, he was always searching for his partner, following the sound of barking through endless corridors that led nowhere, calling out to a dog who was always just beyond reach. His parents tried to understand, tried to help, but there was a gulf between Jake's experience and theirs that seemed impossible to bridge. Physical therapy helped with his shoulder, but nothing seemed to help with the crushing sense of guilt and loss that followed Jake everywhere. He had left his partner behind. Rex had been wounded, protecting him, and Jake had been evacuated to safety while Rex fought for his life in a foreign country. The logical part of Jake's mind knew that he'd had no choice, that military medical evacuations didn't include provisions for wounded animals. But logic provided no comfort during the long, sleepless nights. When the call finally came that Rex was being shipped to the United States and that Jake's adoption request had been approved, it felt like receiving news that a family member was finally coming home from the dead. Jake drove to the military transport facility in Colorado, his hands shaking on the steering wheel as he tried to prepare himself for what he might find. Rex had been wounded, had undergone multiple surgeries, had spent 8 months in rehabilitation. Would he even remember Jake? Would their bond have survived the trauma and separation? The moment Rex limped out of the transport crate, favoring his right rear leg where shrapnel had torn through muscle and tendon, Jake knew that some connections transcend time and distance and injury. The dog's eyes locked onto Jake's face, and his tail began wagging with an intensity that Jake remembered from their first meeting at Bagram Air Base. Rex moved slowly, carefully, but he moved directly to Jake and pressed his head against his former handler's chest, the same gesture of trust and affection that had marked their relationship in Afghanistan. But the Rex who came home was different from the dog Jake had deployed with. He startled at loud noises, something he had never done in combat. He was protective to the point of aggression with strangers, positioning himself between Jake and anyone he didn't recognize. Most significantly, Rex seemed to have developed an almost supernatural awareness of Jake's emotional state, staying closer when Jake was struggling with memories, becoming more alert when Jake's anxiety spiked. Their first months together in Montana were a process of mutual healing and rediscovery. Jake found that caring for Rex gave him purpose, a reason to get out of bed when the depression was overwhelming. Rex's presence made the nightmares less frequent, his warmth a comfort during panic attacks, his need for exercise forcing Jake to leave the house even when he wanted to hide from the world. They were both damaged, both struggling to find their place in a peaceful world after experiencing the intensity of combat, but they were healing together, one day at a time. 2 years after returning from Afghanistan, Jake Morrison was drowning in plain sight. On paper, his transition looked successful. He had a small apartment in Billings, a part-time job at a local hardware store, and regular appointments with a VA counselor who assured him that his adjustment was progressing normally. But the numbers on the forms didn't capture the reality of Jake's daily struggle with demons that Rex could sense but couldn't fight. The nightmares had evolved, becoming more vivid and more frequent despite the medications prescribed by VA psychiatrists. Jake would wake up at 3 a.m, his heart hammering, sweat-soaked sheets clinging to his body as the echoes of gunfire faded from his consciousness. Rex would always be there, pressed against Jake's side, his warm weight an anchor to reality. The dog had developed his own response to Jake's night terrors, gently licking his face until Jake was fully awake, then positioning himself protectively between Jake and the door until his breathing returned to normal. The job at Morrison Hardware, no relation to Jake's family name, just an ironic coincidence, was supposed to provide structure and purpose, but it had become another source of stress. The crowded aisles triggered Jake's hypervigilance, making him constantly scan for threats that didn't exist. The sound of power tools reminded him of gunfire. Customer complaints about delayed deliveries sent his anxiety spiking to levels that made his hands shake and his vision blur. His manager, a well-meaning Vietnam veteran named Tom, tried to be understanding, but Jake could see the frustration building as he called in sick more frequently or left early when panic attacks overwhelmed his ability to function. Rex watched everything with the intense focus that had made him such an effective military working dog. The German Shepherd had appointed himself Jake's personal security detail, following him from room to room, positioning himself where he could observe both Jake and any potential approaches to their apartment. But Rex's protective instincts had begun manifesting in problematic ways. He growled at neighbors who approached too quickly, refused to let maintenance workers enter the apartment, and had bitten a delivery driver who had startled Jake by knocking loudly on the door. The isolation was the worst part. Jake's family called regularly, his parents driving the 3 hours from the ranch to visit every few weeks, but their conversations felt forced and artificial. They would ask about his job, his counseling, his plans for the future, carefully avoiding any mention of Afghanistan or the war. Jake appreciated their intentions, but the careful tiptoeing around his trauma made him feel like an unexploded bomb that everyone was afraid might detonate if handled incorrectly. His relationship with Sarah, a nurse he had met at the VA hospital, had shown promise for several months. She understood trauma, having worked with combat veterans for years, and she had seemed to genuinely care about both Jake and Rex. But Jake's inability to sleep through the night, his tendency to scan every room for exits and threats, and his complete inability to discuss his military service had eventually worn down even her considerable patience. The breakup had been gentle and understanding, which somehow made it worse than if she had simply walked away angry. The drinking started gradually, a beer with dinner to help him relax, a shot of whiskey before bed to quiet the memories. But alcohol provided only temporary relief, and the quantities required to achieve numbness kept increasing. Jake was smart enough to know he was developing a problem, but not strong enough to stop. Rex seemed to understand what was happening, becoming increasingly agitated when Jake drank, whining and pacing, as if he could sense the self-destructive path his human was walking. The final breaking point came on a cold February evening when Jake returned from another unsuccessful job interview, his third termination in 18 months. The position had been perfect: night security at a warehouse, minimal human contact, work that would have utilized his military training. But the background check had revealed his recent employment history, and the hiring manager had politely explained that they needed someone more stable and reliable. Jake sat in his apartment, Rex pressed against his leg, and felt the crushing weight of complete hopelessness settle over him like a suffocating blanket. He was 26 years old, a decorated Marine veteran, and he couldn't hold down a simple civilian job. The benefits from his disability rating covered his basic expenses, but what kind of life was he living? What kind of future did he have? And most importantly, what was he putting Rex through by forcing the dog to watch him slowly destroy himself? For the first time since coming home, Jake began to seriously consider that maybe everyone would be better off if he just stopped fighting the war that continued to rage inside his head. Rex seemed to sense the darkness of his thoughts, pressing closer, his brown eyes fixed on Jake's face with an expression that seemed almost human in its concern and love. March in Montana brought the false promise of spring, with temperatures that climbed above freezing during the day but plunged back into winter's grip each night. Jake had been unemployed for 6 weeks, his savings account dwindling towards zero, his VA disability payments barely covering rent and food. More troubling than the financial pressure was the increasing frequency of what his counselor called intrusive thoughts, moments when Jake would find himself planning his own death with the same methodical precision he had once applied to military operations. Rex had become hypervigilant in ways that went beyond his protective training. The dog barely left Jake's side, following him to the bathroom, positioning himself between Jake and the kitchen knives, whining anxiously whenever Jake stood too close to windows or balconies. It was as if Rex could read Jake's darkening thoughts and was determined to prevent him from acting on them. But the constant surveillance was becoming another source of stress in Jake's increasingly fragmented world. The argument with his parents had been building for weeks. His father, a retired rancher who believed in solving problems through hard work and determination, couldn't understand why Jake wasn't getting better after 2 years of counseling and medication. His mother, whose heart broke every time she saw her son's hollow eyes and trembling hands, kept suggesting that maybe Jake should come home to the ranch, as if the wide-open spaces of his childhood could somehow heal wounds that had been carved by war. "You're wallowing, son," his father had said during their last phone call, his voice tight with frustration and fear. "Rex needs exercise. You need purpose, and sitting in that apartment isn't helping either of you. Come home. Help me with the spring carving. Get your hands dirty again." But Jake couldn't explain to his father that the ranch's isolation felt like a trap, that the sound of cattle reminded him of convoys, that the sight of his father's hunting rifles triggered panic attacks that left him gasping for air. He couldn't articulate that coming home felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that the war had broken something in him that could never be repaired. The conversation had ended with his father's angry words echoing through the apartment. That dog saved your life twice in Afghanistan. Don't make him watch you waste the life he fought so hard to protect." Jake had hung up and immediately reached for the bottle of bourbon that had become his most reliable companion, but Rex had positioned himself between Jake and the kitchen, his brown eyes reflecting an intelligence that was almost human in its understanding. The turning point came on a Tuesday night when Jake's neighbor, Mrs. Chen, knocked on his door to complain about Rex's barking. The elderly woman had been patient with Jake's struggles, but her own sleep was being disrupted by Rex's increasingly vocal distress whenever Jake's nightmares struck. Standing in his doorway at 11 o'clock at night, her robe pulled tight against the cold, she looked at Jake with a mixture of sympathy and exhaustion. "I know you're having a hard time, Jake," she said softly, "but that poor dog is crying for help. He knows something is wrong, and he's trying to tell everyone who will listen. Maybe you should listen to him too." After she left, Jake sat on his couch with Rex pressed against his side, both of them staring at the bottle of sleeping pills on the coffee table. Jake's counselor had prescribed them for his insomnia, but Jake had been hoarding them, collecting enough for what he told himself was just a backup plan, an insurance policy in case the pain became unbearable. Tonight, with eviction notices piling up and job prospects non-existent, the pain felt unbearable. Rex seemed to sense the finality in Jake's thoughts. The dog began whining, a high-pitched sound of distress that Jake had never heard before. When Jake reached for the pill bottle, Rex knocked it away with his paw, sending pills scattering across the floor. When Jake tried to collect them, Rex gently but firmly blocked him, using his body to create a barrier between Jake and his means of self-destruction. "I can't do this anymore, boy," Jake whispered, his voice breaking as tears he had held back for months finally began to fall. "I'm sorry, but I just can't. You deserve better than this. You deserve someone who isn't broken." Rex's response was to press his head against Jake's chest and stay there, his weight warm and solid and reassuring. But Jake's decision was made. He would wait until Rex was asleep, then slip away quietly. The dog had already saved his life twice in Afghanistan. Jake wouldn't make him watch the final battle that Jake was no longer strong enough to fight. What Jake didn't understand was that Rex had no intention of sleeping that night, and that the bond forged in combat was about to be tested in ways that would prove whether love could conquer even the darkest moments of human despair. Jake waited until 3 in the morning, the dead hour when the world was at its quietest and his resolve was at its strongest. Rex had been lying beside the couch for hours, his breathing steady but his eyes occasionally opening to check on Jake's position. Jake had learned to read his partner's sleep patterns during their deployment, and he knew that Rex was dozing rather than deeply asleep, maintaining the light vigilance that had kept them both alive in Afghanistan. Moving with the stealth that military training had ingrained in him, Jake slowly stood from the couch, careful not to disturb the cushions or make any sound that might alert Rex. His plan was simple: slip out of the apartment, drive his truck to the remote area near Bear Creek, where he and Rex had hiked during their better days, and use his service pistol to end the war that continued to rage inside his head. He had written letters to his parents and to Sarah, explaining that his decision had nothing to do with their love or support, and everything to do with his inability to carry the weight of his memories any longer. Rex's eyes snapped open the moment Jake's feet touched the floor. The dog's head lifted, and Jake could see the intelligence and concern in those brown eyes that had watched over him through countless dangerous missions. For a moment, neither moved. Then Rex stood slowly, his injured leg causing him to favor his right side, and positioned himself directly in front of the apartment door. "It's okay, boy," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm just going out for a while. You stay here where it's warm." But Rex knew. Somehow, with the same inexplicable intuition that had detected IEDs and Taliban ambushes, Rex understood that Jake's late-night departure would be permanent. The dog sat down in front of the door and stared at Jake with an expression that seemed to say, "You're not leaving without me." Jake tried to move around Rex, but the dog shifted to block his path. When Jake gently pushed against Rex's shoulder, trying to move him aside, the German shepherd responded by lying down across the threshold, making it impossible to open the door without stepping over him. Jake could have commanded Rex to move, could have used the authority that their military training had established, but looking down at his partner's determined face, Jake found himself unable to give the order. "Please, Rex," Jake said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Let me go. You've done enough. You've saved me twice already. You don't have to save me again." Rex's response was to stand up, walk to where Jake kept his truck keys on the kitchen counter, and knock them to the floor with his paw. Then he returned to his position, blocking the door, his message clear. They would face this crisis together, or they wouldn't face it at all. The standoff continued for 20 minutes, Jake pleading with Rex to move aside, Rex refusing to budge from his protective position. Finally, Jake sank to the floor beside his partner, overwhelmed by exhaustion and the crushing realization that even in his darkest moment, he couldn't bear the thought of abandoning the dog who had never abandoned him. "I'm so tired, boy," Jake whispered, wrapping his arms around Rex's neck. "I don't know how to keep fighting. I don't know how to live with what happened over there." Rex seemed to understand that Jake's despair had reached its breaking point. The dog began doing something he had never done before. He started systematically destroying everything in the apartment that Jake might use to harm himself. Rex knocked over the bottle of bourbon, soaking the carpet with alcohol. He knocked the bottle of sleeping pills off the coffee table and scattered them across the floor where Jake couldn't collect them without Rex's cooperation. Most remarkably, he used his teeth to remove Jake's service pistol from its hiding place and carried it to the far corner of the apartment, positioning himself between the weapon and his human. But Rex's most profound act came when Jake, overwhelmed by his partner's determination to keep him alive, began sobbing uncontrollably. The dog pressed his body against Jake's, providing warmth and comfort, but he also began howling, not the aggressive bark of a guard dog or the excited yip of play, but a long, mournful sound that seemed to express all the pain and trauma that neither of them could put into words. The howling continued for nearly an hour, growing weaker as Rex's voice gave out, but never stopping completely. It was as if the dog was crying for both of them, giving voice to the grief and loss and survivor's guilt that Jake had been carrying since their return from Afghanistan. Neighbors later said they had never heard anything so heartbreaking, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of a soul in anguish. When the howling finally stopped, Rex collapsed beside Jake, his breathing labored and his body trembling with exhaustion. The effort of staying awake all night, of physically preventing Jake's suicide attempt, of emotionally carrying both their burdens, had pushed the injured war dog beyond his limits. But he had accomplished his mission. Jake was alive, and the crisis had passed. As dawn broke through the apartment windows, Jake realized that Rex had saved his life for the third time, and that this rescue had cost his partner everything he had left to give. The emergency veterinary clinic was a blur of bright lights and urgent voices as Jake carried Rex's limp body through the automatic doors at 7:23 a.m. The dog was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and irregular, his body temperature dangerously low from the night's exertions. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the lead veterinarian, took one look at Rex's condition and immediately ordered him into the intensive care unit. "What happened?" Dr. Martinez asked as her team worked to stabilize Rex's vital signs. Jake struggled to explain the night's events without revealing his own suicidal intentions. "He was protecting me," was all he could manage. "He wouldn't stop. He just kept going until he collapsed." The next 72 hours were the longest of Jake's life. He never left the veterinary hospital, sleeping in the waiting room chairs and surviving on vending machine coffee and the kindness of staff who understood the bond between a veteran and his service dog. Rex remained in critical condition, his body fighting multiple organ stress brought on by extreme exertion and emotional trauma. Dr. Martinez explained that Rex's collapse wasn't just physical exhaustion. "Dogs can experience something similar to what humans call a nervous breakdown," she said gently. "He's been carrying emotional stress for a long time, probably mirroring your own struggles. Last night, he gave everything he had to save you, and his body couldn't handle the overload." Jake's parents arrived on the second day, having driven through the night when Jake finally called to tell them what had happened. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, Jake broke down completely and told them everything, about the nightmares, the drinking, the job losses, and the night Rex had prevented his suicide. His mother held him as he sobbed, while his father stood quietly, tears streaming down his weathered face. "That dog loves you more than life itself," his father said finally. "The question is, what are you going to do with the life he's fought so hard to save?" On the third day, Rex's condition stabilized enough for Jake to visit him in the ICU. The proud German shepherd, who had faced down Taliban fighters and detected deadly explosives, looked fragile and small, surrounded by medical equipment. But when Rex saw Jake approach his kennel, his tail moved weakly against the blankets, and his eyes showed the same intelligence and devotion that had defined their partnership from the beginning. Jake reached through the kennel bars and gently stroked Rex's head. "I'm sorry, boy," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I put you through this. But I promise you, I'm going to fight. I'm going to get better. You've saved me 3 times now, and I won't let any of those saves be wasted." Rex's recovery would take weeks, but Jake's recovery would take much longer. The difference was that now, finally, Jake was ready to begin the real work of healing, motivated not by his own desire to live, but by his responsibility to be worthy of the love that had literally saved his life. Rex's recovery defied every veterinary prognosis. Dr. Martinez had warned that the physical and emotional trauma might have permanent effects, possible heart damage, chronic pain, behavioral changes that could make him unpredictable or aggressive. Instead, Rex seemed to draw strength from Jake's newfound commitment to healing, as if the dog understood that his ultimate sacrifice had finally broken through the wall of despair that had imprisoned his human. Jake threw himself into recovery with the same intensity he had once applied to military missions. He attended AA meetings religiously, finding strength in stories of other people who had battled their demons and won. He started seeing a new therapist who specialized in veteran suicide prevention, a woman who had lost her own brother to PTSD and understood the unique challenges facing combat veterans. Most importantly, he began volunteering at the local VA hospital, sharing his story with other veterans who were struggling with thoughts of suicide. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. There were setbacks, days when the nightmares returned with crushing intensity, moments when Jake questioned whether he had the strength to continue fighting. But now he had something he had lacked before, a sense of purpose that went beyond his own survival. Rex had nearly died saving Jake's life. That sacrifice demanded that Jake not just survive, but thrive. 6 months after the crisis, Jake and Rex moved back to his parents' ranch. The wide open spaces that had once triggered Jake's anxiety now became part of his healing process. Working alongside his father during calving season, Jake found that physical labor helped quiet the chaos in his mind. Rex, though moving more slowly due to his injuries, resumed his natural role as a working dog, helping herd cattle with an enthusiasm that proved his spirit remained unbroken. The ranch became a sanctuary, not just for Jake and Rex, but for other veterans struggling with similar challenges. Word spread through VA networks about the young Marine who had nearly died by suicide, but was now helping others find reasons to live. Veterans began visiting the ranch, some staying for weeks, working alongside Jake and finding healing in the simple rhythms of rural life and the company of someone who truly understood their struggles. Rex became the unofficial therapy dog for every veteran who visited the ranch. The German Shepherd seemed to possess an uncanny ability to identify which visitors were struggling most severely, spending extra time with those who were closest to their breaking points. Several veterans later credited Rex with saving their lives simply by refusing to leave their sides during their darkest moments. Jake established the Rex Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to pairing retired military working dogs with veterans suffering from PTSD and suicidal ideation. The program was based on the simple but profound truth that Jake had learned. Sometimes, the unconditional love of a dog who understands trauma can provide the bridge between despair and hope that no human counselor can offer. As Rex aged, his health declined gradually but peacefully. The injuries from Afghanistan, combined with the physical toll of that night when he had prevented Jake's suicide, eventually caught up with him. But he lived to see the foundation that bore his name help more than 300 veterans find healing through relationships with retired military working dogs. On a quiet morning in October, nearly 4 years after that critical night in the apartment, Rex died peacefully in his sleep on the ranch where he had found happiness after war. Jake was with him at the end, holding his old partner's head as Rex's breathing slowly faded into silence. The funeral service for Rex drew more than 200 people to the small cemetery on the Morrison Ranch. Active duty Marines served as pallbearers, carrying the flag-draped casket of a dog who had saved not just Jake's life, but the lives of countless veterans who had found hope through the foundation Rex inspired. The ceremony included full military honors, with a bugler playing taps as Rex was laid to rest, overlooking the Montana mountains he had grown to love. Jake's eulogy was simple but powerful. Rex saved my life 3 times. Twice in Afghanistan when he detected threats that would have killed me and my fellow Marines, and once in my apartment in Billings when he refused to let me give up on myself. But the real miracle isn't that he saved me. It's what he did after saving me. He showed me that survival isn't enough. He taught me that we have a responsibility to use our second chances, our third chances, our fourth chances to help others find their own reasons to keep fighting. The statistics are sobering. 22 veterans die by suicide every day in the United States. PTSD affects nearly 30% of all combat veterans, and many struggle for years to find effective treatment. But programs like the Rex Foundation are making a difference, proving that sometimes the most powerful therapy comes not from medication or counseling sessions, but from the devoted love of a dog who understands trauma and refuses to give up on the human they've chosen to protect. Today, Jake Morrison runs veteran retreat programs at his family ranch, where former military working dogs live out their retirement years alongside the veterans they continue to serve. The waiting list for the program stretches more than 2 years, as word spreads about the healing that happens when warriors, both human and canine, support each other through the long journey back from the darkness of war. Rex's legacy lives on in every veteran who finds hope through the foundation that bears his name, in every military working dog who retires to a loving home instead of being euthanized, and in every life saved by the simple but profound understanding that sometimes love requires sacrifice, and that true courage isn't about facing the enemy. It's about refusing to let your brothers and sisters face their battles alone. The bond between a soldier and his dog transcends species, transcends time, and transcends even death itself. Rex proved that some promises are too sacred to break, and some love too powerful to surrender to despair. He saved Jake's life 3 times, but his greatest victory was teaching Jake how to save others. That mission continues, one veteran at a time, one dog at a time, one life at a time. If you know a veteran who is struggling, reach out. If you're struggling yourself, remember Rex's lesson. You are worth fighting for, and you don't have to fight alone.